She couldn't hold back the laughter. What started as a quiet smirk quickly grew into a sharp, mocking chuckle. The man ahead of her in the grocery store line was moving slowly, his left leg dragging painfully with each step. Impatient, she rolled her eyes and muttered loud enough for others to hear. "If you can't walk properly, maybe you should just stay home." The other shoppers glanced away, uncomfortable, but she felt justified. After all, why should one person hold up a line? The man didn't react. His shoulders tensed slightly, but he kept his gaze fixed forward, taking one deliberate, labored step after another. There was a quiet dignity in the way he carried himself, something that made her mocking words sting deeper in hindsight. She had no idea that this was no ordinary stranger, no random inconvenience. What she couldn't have known was that the very limp she mocked was a hard-earned testament to courage. 23 years ago, during a brutal firefight in a desert far from here, this man had crawled through enemy gunfire, risking everything to drag her own father to safety. The injury she scoffed at was proof of a sacrifice she was blind to. And in less than an hour, everything was about to change. The truth would come out in a way she could never have imagined, forcing her to confront the cost of her cruelty and the true meaning of honor. Welcome to the Silent Ranks. Before we continue with this powerful story about consequences and redemption, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories about respect and the hidden sacrifices around us deserve to be heard, please hit that subscribe button to support our channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being part of this journey. The grocery store was one of those large suburban chains where efficiency mattered more than atmosphere. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in harsh white light that made tired faces look worse and turned shopping into a chore rather than an experience. Saturday afternoon brought the usual crowd. Families restocking for the week, elderly couples moving slowly through familiar routines, and impatient professionals trying to squeeze errands between other obligations. Sarah Mitchell had been having one of those days where nothing went right. Her morning meeting had run long, her lunch plans had fallen through, and now she found herself stuck behind what seemed like the slowest moving person in the entire store. She checked her phone repeatedly, shifted her weight from foot to foot, and made the kind of sighs that were designed to be heard by everyone within 20 feet. The man ahead of her appeared to be in his early 50s, with graying hair and shoulders that suggested he had once been powerfully built. But it was his walk that caught her attention and held it in the most uncomfortable way. His left leg moved stiffly, dragging slightly with each step, creating a rhythm that was both pronounced and painful to watch. Every movement seemed to require effort, every step a small victory over something that wanted to keep him still. Sarah's impatience transformed into something darker as she watched him navigate the checkout process. He moved carefully, methodically, taking time with each action that would have been automatic for someone else. She found herself imagining how much faster her own day would be moving if she didn't have to wait for people who clearly struggled with basic tasks that most people took for granted. The cruel thoughts became cruel words before she could stop them. She began with quiet comments to herself, observations about people who should plan better or shop during off-peak hours if they needed extra time. But the comments grew louder, more pointed, designed not just to express her frustration, but to be heard by others who might share her impatience. When the man ahead of her dropped his credit card and had to slowly bend to retrieve it, Sarah's commentary reached a level that made other shoppers uncomfortable. She wondered aloud why some people didn't just stay home if walking was such a challenge, suggested that online shopping might be more appropriate for those who couldn't move at normal speeds, and made it clear that her time was being wasted by someone else's limitations. The man's back stiffened. His movements became even more careful, more deliberate, but he didn't turn around. He didn't respond to her comments or acknowledge her presence. He simply continued with his transaction, his dignity intact despite the assault on it happening just feet behind him. Something in his posture suggested this wasn't the first time he had endured such treatment, that he had developed a way of carrying himself through these moments that protected something essential from being damaged by cruelty. Other customers began to notice the situation. A few looked uncomfortable, glancing between Sarah and the man she was targeting. An elderly woman in line behind Sarah shook her head disapprovingly. A young mother pulled her children closer, as if trying to shield them from witnessing meanness that served no purpose except to make one person feel superior to another. But Sarah was too caught up in her own frustration to notice the reactions around her. She had found a target for all the day's accumulated irritations, and the anonymity of a public place made her feel free to express thoughts that she might have kept to herself in other circumstances. The man's disability had become, in her mind, a personal inconvenience rather than a condition that deserved compassion or at least basic respect. The veteran, whose name was Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, had been shopping for groceries that would last him the week. His disability check didn't allow for much variety, but he had learned to make simple meals that didn't require too much standing or complicated preparation. The limp that drew so much unwanted attention was the result of injuries sustained in Iraq in 2001, when an improvised explosive device had shattered his left leg and ended his military career in a single, devastating moment. What people didn't see when they looked at his awkward gait was the months of rehabilitation, the surgeries that had saved the leg but couldn't restore its full function, the daily pain that he had learned to manage without complaint. They didn't see the physical therapy sessions where he had relearned to walk, the determination that had carried him through recovery, or the pride he still felt in having served his country, even though that service had cost him more than most people would ever sacrifice for anything. Torres had developed a thick skin over the years. He had learned to ignore stares, to deflect pity, and to navigate a world that wasn't always designed for people with disabilities. But the woman behind him in line was pushing past his usual defenses with her particular brand of public cruelty. Her comments weren't just thoughtless. They were deliberately hurtful, designed to humiliate rather than simply express impatience. He finished his transaction with the same careful attention he brought to everything, counted his change, gathered his bags, and began the slow journey toward the exit. Behind him, Sarah's commentary continued, now focused on how much time the entire interaction had wasted and how inconsiderate some people could be about the needs of others who had places to be and things to accomplish. Sarah completed her own shopping quickly, her mood only slightly improved by the knowledge that she was no longer trapped behind someone moving at what she considered an unacceptable pace. She loaded her groceries into her car and drove home with the satisfied feeling of someone who had successfully navigated a minor frustration and emerged victorious on the other side. Her house was a tidy suburban home that she shared with her aging father, a man whose health had been declining gradually but noticeably over the past few years. Robert Mitchell was 71 years old, a Vietnam veteran who had served 2 tours before returning home to build a successful career in construction management. He was proud of his military service but rarely talked about it in detail, carrying his experiences like many veterans of his generation, privately, quietly, with a dignity that didn't require explanation or validation from others. Sarah found her father in his favorite chair, looking through a box of old photographs that she rarely saw him examine. He seemed more reflective than usual, holding each picture for a long time before moving to the next. When she asked about his afternoon, he mentioned that he had been thinking about old friends, people he had served with who had remained important to him even after decades of separation. The conversation was casual until her father mentioned that he had been trying to track down someone he had served with, a soldier who had saved his life during a particularly dangerous mission. Sarah half listened while putting away groceries, her mind still occupied with the day's frustrations and the evening's plans. Her father's war stories had become background noise over the years, familiar but not particularly engaging to someone who had never experienced anything similar. But something in her father's tone made her pay closer attention when he began describing the incident that had nearly cost him his life. He spoke about a routine patrol that had turned deadly when their convoy hit an improvised explosive device. He had been thrown from the vehicle, his legs pinned under twisted metal, unable to move while enemy fire erupted around them. The situation had been hopeless until one soldier had crawled through the chaos to reach him. Robert's voice grew quiet as he described how Staff Sergeant Michael Torres had dragged him to safety despite being wounded himself. Torres had taken shrapnel in his left leg during the rescue, injuries that had seemed minor at the time but had developed complications that ultimately ended his military career. Robert had tried to stay in touch after they were both discharged, but Torres had disappeared into the civilian world without leaving much of a trail to follow. Sarah continued her routine, only partially engaged with the story until her father mentioned the name again. Michael Torres. Something about the name felt familiar, but she couldn't place why. Her father continued talking about how he had been searching for Torres for years, hoping to properly thank the man who had given up his own career to save Robert's life. He had hired private investigators, contacted veterans organizations, and followed every lead that might help him find the soldier who had literally given him a second chance at life. The conversation continued through dinner, with Robert sharing details about Torres that he had never mentioned before. He described a man of quiet courage, someone who never sought recognition but always stepped forward when others needed help. He talked about Torres's dedication to his fellow soldiers, his refusal to leave anyone behind, and the price he had paid for putting others' lives before his own safety. After dinner, Robert showed Sarah a photograph from his military days. It was faded and worn, showing a group of soldiers in desert camouflage standing beside a military vehicle. He pointed to himself, much younger, and wearing the confident expression of someone who had not yet learned how quickly everything could change. Then he pointed to another soldier, a man with kind eyes and a slight smile who stood with the easy posture of someone comfortable with responsibility. That was when Sarah's world began to collapse. The face in the photograph was older, worn by years and pain, but unmistakably familiar. It was the face of the man she had mocked in the grocery store just hours earlier. The man whose disability she had ridiculed, whose struggles she had turned into entertainment, whose dignity she had tried to strip away with her cruel commentary, was the same man who had sacrificed his career and his health to save her father's life. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Every word she had spoken, every laugh she had indulged, every moment of superiority she had felt came rushing back with a clarity that made her sick. She had spent 20 minutes humiliating the man who was responsible for her father being alive to tell the story. She had mocked the very injury that had been earned saving the life of the person she loved most in the world. Sarah's hands shook as she held the photograph, trying to reconcile the confident soldier in the picture with the struggling man she had encountered that afternoon. The limp she had found so annoying was the direct result of his heroism. The careful movements she had ridiculed were the aftermath of sacrifice. The dignity he had maintained in the face of her cruelty was the same strength that had carried him through enemy fire to save her father. She tried to speak, but couldn't find words that seemed adequate to the magnitude of her mistake. Her father, noticing her sudden pallor, asked if she was feeling all right. How could she explain that she had just discovered she was the kind of person who would mock a hero without knowing it? How could she admit that she had spent the afternoon being cruel to the man her father had been desperately trying to find and thank? The guilt was overwhelming, but it was complicated by the realization that her cruelty hadn't been accidental or thoughtless. She had deliberately chosen to be mean to someone who was struggling, had taken pleasure in feeling superior to a stranger who had done nothing to deserve her ridicule. The fact that her target turned out to be someone who had literally saved her father's life made the situation worse. But it didn't change the fundamental truth about what kind of person would behave that way in the first place. Sarah spent the night unable to sleep, replaying every moment of the grocery store encounter and imagining how different it would have been if she had known who Michael Torres was. But the more honest part of her mind acknowledged that his identity shouldn't have mattered. He deserved basic respect and kindness regardless of his history, regardless of whether he had saved anyone's life, simply because he was a human being dealing with a disability that clearly caused him difficulty and pain. The next morning brought no relief from the weight of her realization. Sarah found herself obsessed with the need to make amends, to somehow undo the damage she had caused, to transform herself from the villain of Torres's grocery store experience into someone worthy of his forgiveness. But she had no way to find him, no idea where he lived or shopped, or spent his time beyond that single encounter that she had turned into such a painful memory. She began by telling her father what had happened, a confession that was as difficult as anything she had ever had to say. Robert's reaction was worse than anger. It was disappointment so profound that it seemed to age him before her eyes. He looked at his daughter as if seeing someone he didn't recognize, someone capable of a cruelty that went against everything he had taught her about treating others with dignity and respect. But Robert's disappointment was tempered by his own desperate need to find Torres and express the gratitude he had been carrying for over 2 decades. Sarah's encounter, however shameful, represented the first solid lead he had found in years of searching. The grocery store was local, which meant Torres probably lived nearby. It was the kind of breakthrough that could finally allow Robert to complete something that had been unfinished for far too long. Father and daughter began a search that consumed their days and nights. They visited grocery stores, hoping to encounter Torres again. They contacted local veterans organizations, hoping someone might know him or be able to pass along a message. They drove through neighborhoods, looking for signs of his presence, hoping to find some trace of the man who had become central to both their needs. Robert's need to thank him, and Sarah's need to ask for forgiveness. The search took weeks, but finally produced results when a volunteer at a veterans support group recognized Torres's name and provided a phone number. The conversation that followed was awkward and emotional, with Robert explaining who he was and Sarah struggling to find words that could acknowledge her behavior without making excuses for it. Torres agreed to meet them, perhaps out of curiosity about Robert's persistent gratitude, perhaps out of recognition that some conversations need to happen regardless of how uncomfortable they might be. The meeting was arranged for a quiet coffee shop where they could talk without drawing attention or creating additional pressure for anyone involved. When Torres arrived, moving with the same careful gait that Sarah had mocked, the three of them sat in a silence that was heavy with different kinds of emotion. Robert's face showed the gratitude he had been waiting decades to express. Sarah's face showed shame so profound it was painful to witness. Torres's face showed the quiet strength that had carried him through military service, injury, recovery, and the daily challenges of living with disability in a world that didn't always make space for people like him. Robert spoke first, his voice breaking as he tried to express gratitude that felt bigger than words could contain. He talked about the life he had been able to live because of Torres's courage, about the daughter he had been able to raise, about the career he had been able to build, about all the ordinary moments that had been made possible by one extraordinary act of heroism in a desert war zone that most people had forgotten. Torres listened with the same quiet attention he brought to everything, occasionally nodding but not interrupting. When Robert finished, Torres spoke about memory and service and the bonds between soldiers that don't diminish with time or distance. He talked about doing what needed to be done without thinking about consequences, about the way military training prepared you to act when action was required, about the satisfaction that came from knowing your service had meaning beyond the immediate moment. Then it was Sarah's turn to speak, and the words came out in a rush of shame and apology that felt both necessary and inadequate. She tried to explain her behavior without excusing it, to acknowledge the cruelty of her actions without asking for understanding she didn't deserve. She talked about the person she had been in that grocery store and the person she wanted to become, about lessons learned too late and changes that needed to happen immediately. Torres listened to her apology with the same quiet dignity he had shown while enduring her mockery. When she finished, he didn't offer easy forgiveness or comfortable reassurance. Instead, he talked about the daily reality of living with disability in a world where people often saw limitations before they saw the person. He talked about the grocery store encounters that happened regularly, the stares and comments and assumptions that came with his visible struggle to do ordinary things. But he also talked about resilience and the choice to focus on positive experiences rather than negative ones, about the people who offered help without being asked and the strangers who treated him with kindness that had nothing to do with his military service. He talked about finding meaning in small acts of decency and the importance of not letting other people's cruelty define your sense of worth. The conversation lasted for hours, moving through anger and shame and gratitude and forgiveness in ways that felt both difficult and necessary. By the end, something had shifted for all three of them. Robert had finally been able to express the gratitude he had carried for decades. Torres had received recognition that he had never sought but perhaps needed. And Sarah had confronted the worst aspects of her own character in a way that demanded real change rather than comfortable self-deception. The meeting didn't end with dramatic reconciliation or perfect resolution. Torres accepted Sarah's apology, but made it clear that forgiveness was something that would have to be earned through changed behavior rather than granted through conversation. Robert finally had the chance to thank the man who had saved his life, but both men understood that some debts can be acknowledged without being fully repaid. Sarah left the coffee shop with a mission that would define the rest of her life. to become someone worthy of the forgiveness she had asked for, to transform her understanding of disability and dignity, and to make sure that her cruelty would be balanced by a lifetime of kindness toward people who deserved better than what the world often gave them. In the months that followed, Sarah volunteered at veterans organizations, learning about the challenges faced by disabled service members and the ways civilian society often failed to support the people who had sacrificed the most for others' freedom. She learned about invisible injuries and visible struggles, about the difference between pity and respect, about the importance of seeing the person rather than the disability. Torres and Robert developed a friendship that filled gaps in both their lives. They met regularly for coffee, sharing stories about military service and civilian adjustment, about the challenges of aging and the satisfaction of looking back on lives that had meaning. Their connection helped Robert process experiences he had carried alone for decades and gave Torres someone who understood the weight of service in ways that most civilians never could. Sarah never became close to Torres in the way her father did, but she earned his respect through consistent actions rather than words. She learned that redemption is a process rather than an event, that changing your character requires more than feeling bad about past behavior. She learned that the person who had mocked a veteran's limp could become someone who advocated for disabled rights, who challenged ableist attitudes, who made sure that her own children understood the importance of treating everyone with dignity regardless of their visible struggles. The grocery store where it all began became a different place for Sarah, a reminder of who she had been and who she was working to become. She shopped there regularly, always alert to opportunities to help people who might be struggling, always conscious of the impact that small acts of kindness or cruelty could have on someone's day. Sometimes she encountered Torres there, moving through his shopping with the same careful determination that had once triggered her impatience. Now those encounters filled her with a mixture of gratitude and ongoing shame, appreciation for the lesson learned and regret for the price that lesson had cost both of them. They would nod to each other, exchanging the acknowledgement of people who shared a difficult history and were still figuring out how to move forward from it. This story was brought to you by the Silent Ranks. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever made assumptions about someone based on what you could see, only to discover that their story was completely different from what you imagined? Have you learned hard lessons about the importance of treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their visible struggles or limitations? Tell us in the comments about a time when you realized you had misjudged someone, and how that experience changed the way you interact with strangers. And if you think stories about second chances and the power of redemption need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.